Hello, everybody. Welcome to the BPF Double Building Safety webinar. Thank you very much to British Property Federation for giving us an opportunity to talk about this very, very important topic. I'm Bella Zavery. I'm a partner in the residential team at Womble Bond Dickinson, and I've got the opportunity today to talk to two very interesting gentlemen. Chris Stevens, who works at Womble Bond Dickinson and is a bit of a legal whiz when it comes to building safety on the legal side, and David Hills of ARC, who is a bit of a guru and a savant when it comes to everything technical on the building safety side as well. So I'm going to pass over to Chris so he can just introduce himself, and then I'll do the same with David, and then we'll kick off the session.
Thanks, Bella. Hi, everyone. Lovely to be with you, and thanks again to the BPF for the invite. My name is Chris Stevens. I'm a senior lawyer within the living team at Womble Bond Dickinson. I am, I suppose, what you'd call a transactional property lawyer, but for the past 7 or 8 years of my career, I've been sort of fairly deeply involved with building safety work through a number of grant administration roles that we hold connected with the public funding support schemes that underpin the remediation and remedial work. And as a result, we've been sort of relatively central to the emerging landscape and environment. So lovely to be able to talk to you this morning. And I will hand over to David.
Thanks, Chris. David?
Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone is well. My name is David Hills. I'm Senior Director at ARC Workplace Risk Limited. I am actually an ex-building control officer, but I've been working for the last 25 years as a consultant, supporting clients in meeting their compliance requirements. And clearly since 2020, I've been very much focused on Building Safety Act. I'm a chartered surveyor, I'm a fire engineer, and I have done some structural engineering works as well in the past. So I'm looking forward to taking you through structural risk assessments. Bella.
Thank you both very much. I think we've got some Renaissance men here. So I'm going to kick off the session just with a couple of very important facts. There are, according to the most recent figures, there are 122 projects which are held up because of the Building Safety Act and Gateway 2 in particular. Of that, 31 of those are new build high-rise projects. The current estimates are that Gateway 2 delays are adding 18 months to construction programs. Some between 6 to 12, but some as much as 2 years. And with viability already a massive issue for construction, this is a huge problem for our housing sector. These figures are very interesting because the target deadline specified by the regulations were that all Gateway 2 decisions would be made within 8 weeks of application, and that new build schemes would be resolved within 12 weeks. We're nowhere near that. So something is not working. And I think today we're going to have a look at some of the reasons why that might be happening. And I think a good place to kick off is probably with you, Chris. Let's have a chat.
Yeah.
You know, the introduction of the Building Safety Act is a once in a generation change. You know, it's huge and it's here to stay. So do you want to run through some of the key changes with us first?
Sure, of course. And just to add to that, from our experience through the public funding schemes, it wouldn't be unusual for Gateway 2 applications to take, you know, considerably longer than 8 weeks.
Yeah.
4 months sometimes is a figure I've heard relayed. So yes, there is a performance issue there. Yeah, let me just pop up the slides for a second. And hopefully that's feeding through.
Yep, we've got them there.
Okay,
thanks, Chris.
Great, thanks. So I've got a brief agenda. Okay, sorry, this is me, which we've done. And then for the purposes of this morning, just sort of four items on the docket. A short section on the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act 2024, which makes some amendments to the Building Safety Act. Some case law and a summary of what has happened that's notable within 2024 and a bit of horizon scanning as to what to expect in 2025. This is the Building Safety Act board with a summary of the key features of the Act, what it does. As Bella has explained, this is a seismic piece of legislation that represents a complete overhaul of the law in this area. And it does a number of interesting and important things. So it creates a new regulator in the shape of the BSR. It creates a regulatory framework for higher risk buildings, so those over 18 metres or 7 stories. It creates protections for leaseholders in respect of the ability to raise certain categories of cost from them. That's going to be a key feature of what we're going to talk about this morning. New design and construction duties for all buildings, and the creation of what we call robust hard stops in the form of planning gateways. And whilst it does all of those important things, there have been some gaps that have been evidenced. You might recall that or I suppose the lawyers on the call might recall that the Levelling Up and Regeneration Act introduced a change to the way the definition of qualifying leaseholder works because of the problem that had been evidenced by the surrender and regrant implication of a lease extension to close the loop and bring that back within the definition. The Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act also does the same. So the Leasehold and Reform Act is the second part of a piece of a legislative work that the government has been doing, and does important things like banning the sale of leasehold houses, making it cheaper and easier for leaseholders to extend their leases, increasing the standard length of lease extensions to 999 years. But it was also used as a vehicle to amend the Act. Implementing regs have been introduced. The provisions of the Act are being phased, so certain provisions are being brought in at different times. And for the purposes of the BSA, those were sections 114, 115, 116 and 120 of the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act. When it was released, the government explanation was that further amendments have been brought in to ensure that the leaseholder protections set out in the BSA are properly secured. So we're just going to have a look at the 3 key changes that are produced by the Act, which are focused around Part 5, which is the part of the Act that deals with obligations in respect of what we call relevant buildings, so anything over 11 metres. And the aim was to ensure that leaseholders continue to be protected from dangerous buildings and from the cost of fixing them. So here we go, that's an extract of the implementing regs, and the bits of the Act that have been brought into force are 114, 5, 16 and 20.
So Chris, just to clarify, these are buildings which are subject to long leasehold interest already. So they're already been built, constructed, long leasehold interests have been granted, and these are legislations that have been brought in to protect those long leaseholders. Yeah.
So this is isolated to existing stock. The new build development regime carries its own set of rules. And particularly what we're looking at is the 2 new legal devices that were introduced by the Building Safety Act in the form of remediation orders and remediation contribution orders. So those are set out at sections 123 and 124 of the Building Safety Act and allow an interested person to apply for either a remediation order or an RCO, as we call them. Mm-hmm. Where a relevant defect is identified in a building. And there were already or are already powers in the Act around applying for those specific orders, but the Leasehold and Freehold Reform Act has extended them. So the first change is that it introduces, in addition to the requirement to remedy a relevant defect, the potential requirement to remedy or to take a relevant step to remedy a relevant defect. There's lots of relevance in this, I'm afraid. But the FTT have been given the power to make orders that act in the alternative or both. So, there is an implication here for asset owners in that up until now, the FTT has made a number of remediation orders requiring persons to remedy a defect in a relevant building. But that disregarded perhaps some more immediate or temporary actions that need to be taken, which I'm sure David will talk about more in his section, like waking watches, like fire sprinkler installations, like comprehensive fire alarm systems. These are all things that landlords and building owners may have held fire. Sorry, that's a terrible pun to use. May have held back on pending the outcome of the litigation process, whereas they are immediately required and are important. So the FTT now has the power to order both, either in the alternative or together. The implication for landlords and building owners is obviously increased cost and a degree of immediacy of performance. It wouldn't be the case that you could wait for contractors to, agree a works contract or to wait during a tender process. If the FTT make an order requiring relevant steps to be taken, it has an immediacy to it. And
There's a question there then, Chris. So who triggers the application to the FTT? How would concerned leaseholder go about it? Because this is going to be relevant, I suspect, if you own a building with lots of leasehold interest and you're receiving ground rents. That's going to be a factor for them, where they might be looking at buildings and thinking, well, how do we manage it? Whereas at the moment, there'd be a relatively, you'd have a management company that would come in and do the management for you. You'd be receiving the ground rents. How concerned should you be on this piece? When should you be taking action?
Well, I mean, that raises a good question. I'll come back to that later in the piece, because there is the suggestion of new criminal offences being created as to a failure to remedy a relevant defect in a building, and you come back to forewarned is forearmed. But
the sooner the better.
the sooner the better, yeah, because you don't want to be caught further down the line once a new criminal offence has been introduced to the statute books. But an interested person has 5 categories to it, one of which is public bodies. So MHCLG have pursued a few remediation orders. There have been privately taken up versions of it. It's still in its infancy, I think. It is a tool that is new and novel. And even lawyers are relatively unfamiliar with how these things work. We've got some case law coming through now that gives us some answers on that. But any person with a legal interest in the building can also apply for a remediation order. So
that's interesting.
Any flat owner is the short answer.
So essentially you must take the initiative rather than waiting for somebody to actually trigger it.
Yeah.
And that seems like a good point. I mean, you mentioned some case law. Have we got some case law that we can talk through?
Yes, well, let me just sort of skip through a couple of slides quickly. But here you've got the definitions of the relevant steps. And then the other provisions sort of drag that concept into how remediation orders and remediation contribution orders can be formed by the FTT, in that they can require either to be made. There is some content on the slides probably for people to look at their own leisure around the concept of a building safety risk, the concept of a relevant building. And I suppose there is a bit of myth busting here, in the sense that I think there is a misunderstanding that the ability to apply for a remediation order or an RCO relates only to HRBs. It isn't. It's any building of more than 11 meters in height, which is a relatively modestly sized building. And if you are a building owner of that type, or act for asset owners or investors who have buildings of that type in their stock, then there is a risk of exposure if steps have not been taken to assess the safety of that building I think the recommendation from us would be sit down with your lawyers, sit down with people like David, get a proper assessment carried out. It can be expensive. I'm sure David will give us better ideas on costs, but some of the figures I see for a fire risk assessment of external walls are 30, 40,000 pounds. So, the process is not cheap, clearly, but investing early and getting a baseline view is going to be critical over the next 5 years, I suppose.
And better than incurring a criminal offence or
Yeah.
the fines that could ensue, which would be considerably higher, I would have thought. And also the reputational damage, the optics of not being compliant, and I suppose the most important factor, that the risk that it's placing on human lives. So yeah,
Yes.
absolutely.
So then we got a bit about remediation orders. As Rory Stewart would say, a brief explainer, a remediation order. If you know your Rusty's politics, a remediation order requires a relevant landlord to remedy specified relevant defects in a specified relevant building by a specified time. So put simply, it has to be something that relates to building works done or not done during a reference period. That's the important other point to bear in mind. These are works that have to have been carried out between 1992 and 2022, which is when Michael Gove first announced the House of Lords amendments that introduced these protective measures for leaseholders and the new tools that have led to the creation of a building safety risk, which is spread of fire and building collapse. So if you can identify those features in a building and you are an interested person, technically you can apply for a remediation order. Similar rules for RCOs, but there is this fair and reasonable test that you need to satisfy. And they are sort of what they sound like. A remediation order is an order to do works. A remediation contribution order is an order to pay towards the cost of those works. And the effect of the relevant steps changes introduced by the LFRA is to allow the FTT to refer to those and draw them into the way that they make those orders. And there is also an expansion of the cost recoveries that can be made. So the FTT is generally a cost neutral environment. Either party bears their own, but and indeed in Schedule 8, which is the part of the Act that introduces the leaseholder protections from charge, that's where they get sheltered. There is a sort of general prohibition on being charged professional costs. But here we have a new entitlement to allow the FTT to make an order that also allows them to recover costs of professional charges.
Mm.
So some legal and professional fees and reporting and what have you can be recovered. But I suppose the critical bit from an asset owner's perspective is that what we call decant fees and temporary rehousing costs can also be covered. We've seen from the work that we do that Waking Watch fees, I know it's a different topic, but Waking Watch fees, decant fees can be prohibitive. I mean, they are extraordinary. The level
Waking Watch is very expensive.
the level of costs involved are huge. So we now have an environment where you already had the remediation order and RCO regime that had already been established. We now have potentially the ability for the FTT to order that relevant steps are taken toward that exercise. Temporary measures to shore up people's safety, which I think we would all acknowledge is important and necessary. But we also now have the ability for the FTT to order that certain kinds of relatively chunky, large costs are also blended into the way these orders are made. And that is likely to impose a new cost burden for building owners that is new.
I mean, just exploring on that one a little bit though. So if you're an investor who's buying subject to existing long leasehold interest, and this is a factor that you must take into account. So it impacts presumably your valuation, it impacts your ability to fund. There is, as I said, we've mentioned the optics, but I suppose the argument then is this is something that needs to be taken into account, and it's important to bring in a high-rise expert who is familiar with all this element and to actually do an assessment before you buy anything, even if the intention is that you're only acquiring it for the purpose of things like ground rents. Not so much of an issue when common hold comes about, because then obviously there'll be new builds at that point, and so they'll be under a different regime. But for existing stock, which is subject to long leasehold interest, this is a factor that potentially needs to be considered at an early stage, potentially before they've even contracted to purchase the sites.
It is, and it only heightens the need for proper DD. I mean, we've developed in-house inquiries dedicated to Building Safety Act work, dedicated drafting to be inserted into contracts that all of our property lawyers have access to. But sitting down with properly qualified and experienced and competent fire safety engineers and surveyors like David, and sitting down with lawyers that understand the law and how it works before making an investment decision or even carrying out a review is more important now than it ever was.
Absolutely. I mean, and that seems like a good point for David, actually. What sort of do you get a lot of requests for these in practice?
Not as much as we should.
Yeah, quite worrying.
It is something that we offer, but I have to say that the take up is not where it needs to be.
And from a practical perspective, if somebody was looking at commissioning this sort of expert advice, how long does the process take? You know, what sort of process? And would you expect a landowner, presumably anybody who owned a building which is subject to this should have this information to hand already, but on the basis that they probably don't, and it has to be started from scratch, how much time should be provided for?
It is not a quick process. We have to accept the fact that the number of chartered fire engineers in the UK is less than 100. And so we need to start thinking about whether the type of building actually requires that particular input. You're talking about a simple FRAEW could take up to, say, 8 to 10 weeks to actually do all the full investigations. Those investigations will need permissions to actually get to the building. A compartmentation survey, for example, which again is very important in certain types of buildings with certain types of strategies, could be undertaken within 4 to 5 weeks, depending upon the nature of the building. A fire risk assessment, depending upon what type, again, is going to be able to be undertaken within that particular period of time. The big problem is actually getting people to actually understand the fact that actually we need to be involved at a very early stage. Due diligence is so important.
I mean, and it's quite funny because some of those timelines align with what we would do as real estate lawyers. You know, we assume there's going to be things like searches, etc. We have to procure, but the messaging here seems to be that actually the initiative, if you are selling stock, or you're refinancing it, you need to be thinking about it early and actually preparing and providing for these things. So actually, when you go to market, it's already been dealt with. Otherwise, the risk is any transaction you're working on is going to be delayed, because all of this process should really be considered.
Just a quick aside on that, Bella. If you think about it, as an accountable person, if you have an existing building that is under the auspices of the Act and definition, you've got a duty now to provide that information to the next accountable person. So it's absolutely superb if you can get it done now, even if you don't intend to offload a property for the next year or two.
Well, it's not just sell. It's refinance.
Exactly.
And generally, it just sounds to me like it's the accountability element before an order is made against you. So I know Chris has given us some potentially scary facts. Are you going to tell us some scary stories now, Chris?
Well, I mean, yes, it sort of adds to the weight of regulatory burden.
Let's do it.
Yeah, let's move on to some case law. Just some interesting cases from 24 that I thought we could usefully talk about. And Smokehouse is an interesting case because it's all about how you measure the height of buildings. There is a requirement at section 65 for buildings of a certain height to be measured, and the Act requires them to be registered with the regulator if they are higher risk buildings or HRBs. There is then a set of regulations that gives the detail as to how the height calculation process works. And there are some diagrams within statutory guidance, and they mimic similar diagrams in approved document B, which is the building control sort of overarching guidance document. And the reason Smokehouse is relevant and important is because when you look at it, it is a building that looks like a 6-story building. So there is ground floor retail, 5 stories of resi above it. And in theory, that would leave you in an 11-meter plus 5-story relevant building. So you're still within the parts of the Act that expose you to the penalty tools, the new devices. And this case was all about an application for a remediation order, which was granted. But it also covered within it the calculation of height. And why that was important was because the FTT made a finding in their, well, they didn't make a finding actually, they stated within their decision, because they're not entitled to make that finding, that in their view, the building was more than 7 stories because of a rooftop garden. And that then becomes important to the owner of that building because it places you in HRB status. It requires you to get the building registered. It exposes you to the complexity and rigor of the HRB regime. And you need to have a principal accountable person. You need to communicate with the regulator. All of that stuff would have been avoided at a lower height level. And the point, there are some fascinating sort of extracts of quotes from the decision, but the problem that we had is that there are gaps in the way the legislation was put together. So you know, the Building Safety Act is a piece of legislation that was required very urgently. It overhauls the law in this area. It was in response to a national scale emergency. All of that was necessary, but there are some concepts where holes have been left. So one of them is the interaction between the Act and the regulations as to what a story is. And the regulations deal with that by exception. So they say a story is not something, rather than being prescriptive about what a story is. There was government guidance that indicated that a story must be fully enclosed to qualify as a story, but that was found to be inconsistent with the strict requirements of the regs. So there's a disjoint between the two, which I'm sure was unintentional, but nonetheless, the FTT looked at the position in the regs and interpreted that strictly, which is their, you know, duty. And the outcome of it was that there's no clear definition of a story, either in the Act or the regs. And the FTT made the point in the decision that the published online guidance on the landing pages at gov.uk was not a reliable method of interpretation of law. And again, I think that this just sort of brings you back to there's a lot of chat and chatter about this topic, which is vast. The Act is huge. It's got 5 parts. It runs to 300 pages. It's got explanatory guidance notes that run to 465. It's got 27 pieces of implementing legislation that sit underneath it. And to be able to properly understand it, you know, lawyers like us who have had involvement over the past 7 years need to be asked questions about what this means for clients and their stock. We're still talking about existing stock, so new builds and developments is a different regime. But it's interesting because the remediation order passed, as I think it would have done anyway, but there was a lot of discussion in the hearing and in the decision about
Mm.
how you do the calculation, what the height of the building is, and how you get there.
The difficulty that I suppose is if you've got a project already underway or it's already been constructed, you're retrospectively being told that you now have to comply when you might not have considered that you did have to comply when you originally put the project on into traction. So I guess it's that additional uncertainty, and it requires almost like a unilateral review of what you've got on site, and that's existing projects, which is going to further impact things like viability, presumably.
And it's, I suppose, particularly relevant to building owners who have either 4 or 6-story buildings, because if a rooftop garden is held to be a story, going forward, then it places those building owners into zones that they had perhaps not planned for.
Well, absolutely. And that's the thing, it's difficult to cost for something like this. It's difficult to understand how that's going to impact valuation, because you're not going to know till a later stage. I mean, that's quite troubling, I guess. Very troubling, particularly because it's kind of an amenity that we see quite common, particularly in London now.
Yes, and something that would be desirable and good for the residents.
Yeah, and open, post COVID, I suspect there was a big driver for bringing in sort of open spaces, giving people access to, for mental well-being. It's part of the kind of process. That's troubling.
I've got 3 cases to talk through. Smokehouse we've done. That's number 1. Number 2 is a case called Lena v Lant Street, again from 2024. This is a case that deals with the sort of the difference between the leaseholder protections as they are introduced into the back of the Act. So Schedule 8 is the part of the Act that introduces the leaseholder protections, and the definition of what the Act terms cladding remediation. So just a few brief facts. Mr. Lena was the leasehold owner, or is, I think still is the leasehold owner of flat 44 in block 1 of 3 blocks at Lant Street that were built in the early 2000s. In 2020, the buildings management company got in touch with the residents to say that they felt that there were some works that needed to be done, and they involved the removal of external cladding, stripping out insulation, installation of fire safety barriers, and then reinstatement of the original panels. It was a cladding removal and replacement job. Mr. Lena decided that he didn't like the idea much of being charged the cost of those works, and the irony of this case is that the per leaseholder cost, or certainly his cost, was very small. This is a case that went to the FTT because it was challenged. At first instance, the FTT decided that the works were not cladding remediation and that Mr. Lena didn't hold a qualifying lease. I'm not going to go into the criteria of what a qualifying lease is, but it's basically a long lease. And that his contribution was therefore due. Being a principled kind of fellow, he decided he didn't like that decision and took it to appeal. And the sum of money involved was tiny. It was £1,200, £1,244. Really, in the context of other similar costs for other projects, that is a very small per leaseholder contribution. And the decision was reversed on appeal by the upper tribunal, who held that the demand was defective in the first place, so that was a procedural failing, but also that he was protected by the protections that exist at the back of the Act, at paragraph 8 of Schedule 8, which, bear with me, which creates a prohibition against the recovery of charges relating to cladding remediation. The FTT found that the works did satisfy the removal and replacement of part of a cladding system, and the point was that his contribution was not therefore required, and the original decision was overturned. What does this mean for us? Why is it important? Well, the sum of money involved was small, but the critical point to bear in mind, and we'll come onto this in relation to the next case, is that the with every case like this that comes through, we're getting more judicial interpretation of the Act and its mechanisms and what it's designed to do, how they should be interpreted, and lessons we can learn. The lesson from this case is that the Act uses an intentionally broad language about cladding remediation and the concept of cladding remediation. It is not cladding. It's not simply the boards. It's the risers and the gaps that run behind it. It's the fire compartmentation. It's the insulation. It's the adhesives. It's the components that lead to how systems are put together. And the tribunal found that the works, when looked at in the round, did qualify for the concept of cladding remediation, and that the removal, as it's on the slide, the removal or replacement of any part of a cladding system that forms part of the outer wall or an external wall system and is unsafe is what you're looking for. So the point being, cladding system as a term should be interpreted widely and includes a lot of stuff.
And the cost can't be passed on to leaseholders. So effectively,
No,
it's a
and
cost that has to be borne by the freeholder.
And yeah, and certain leaseholders are protected. So, you know, building owners have to consider carefully works that they are planning to 11-meter plus buildings and think about whether or not they will be able to recover the costs or not.
I mean, a question, and David, please chime in. I suppose arguably there might be some protections already available if it was a new build that was built not too long ago, say 5-10 years ago, or 5-7 years ago. Is this something that they could potentially look to try to pass on to anybody they've bought from under any collateral warranties or construction provisions, or something they should be thinking they should have hopefully thought about when they purchased? Are you seeing a lot of that? They're trying to recover it from previous owners, or
I think we've got to recognise the fact that we've got the Responsible Actors Scheme.
yeah.
And obviously, therefore, in respect of the new builds,
we've got the developer pledge as well, haven't we?
Exactly, the developer pledges have got to take into consideration there.
Are you actually seeing many claims under that though, David? Are we actually seeing that actually translate to
Yes, a lot.
people?
A
Okay.
lot. But what we're also seeing is a difficulty here in the fact that you will then start to get two chartered fire engineers who have perhaps been paid by two different parties who have come up with different answers. And that you're then going to look at what does a defect actually mean. And I know there's been a recent case in respect of what a defect actually means, but ultimately, yeah, you're going to have a difficult discussion then about how much work needs to be undertaken in respect of an external wall. And Chris is right. I mean, an external wall starts from the inside, finish, goes through the substrate, the insulation, the cavity barriers, as well as the cladding material itself, the outer part of the cladding material. So just because a building is concrete clad doesn't necessarily mean that it's got a safe cladding system.
Or even some kinds of brick construction,
brick slips, which I'll be talking about in a few moments.
Okay, there we go.
So what's the third case study, Chris?
So the third case is Almacantar Centre Point v Ogilvy, which I think is a building David's had personal involvement with, but it's on the corner of New Oxford Street in London. It is a vast building, 34 stories, constructed in the mid-1960s. It was therefore designed and built in the 1960s. And the problem with that is that the one of the reasons for the introduction of the Act was failings of the and the public support schemes was failings in the system of regulatory compliance and monitoring undertaken in this country during a particular period during which poor building practices were evidenced. That's the reason for the reference period, which was set for a 30-year period back from 2022. And the thinking at the time was that that was set intentionally to capture incidences where developers and contractors had been operating poorly, and that the system had not, or was not sophisticated enough to capture those, and that there were therefore failings. So the way that the Act works is that it has sort of two principles working separately at different gear speeds, if you like, is the right way of thinking about it. You've got a waterfall of responsibility that relates to relevant defects and who should remediate them, and therefore who should pay for them. And those are defined by reference to, sorry, too many references in this sentence, but in relation to the reference period, 92 to 22. And then you've got cladding remediation, which is a clear defined concept in its own right in the Act, and is a complete prohibition. Thou shalt not charge leaseholders in respect of cladding remediation. And the Lehner case tells us that the wording and the principles and the language of that is intended to be intentionally broad. Mm. If you thought that the reference period was therefore the 30 years before 2022, you should ask yourself, how on earth does a 1960s building get into the mix? And the problem was all around the windows. The windows were rotting and allowing water to come through. And the landlord had identified the problem, had got in touch with the tenants from as early ago as 2011. They'd sent out projected costs to them around, which I think from memory, around the sort of £6-7 million mark. And they had made clear to the residents that they did not want to commence the necessary remedial works until they had all leaseholders' approval. And of course, as is always the case, one held out. The Act then came into force, and the tribunal had to consider the matter and raised a number of interesting points in their decision. Again, as you can see from the slide, there is no definition of cladding in the Act. There is a definition of a cladding system, cladding remediation, but actually no definition of cladding. Again, you sort of go back to the regs and the LFRA. We don't have a clear definition of story either. And there are these little gaps in the Act that need to be filled in, and there are vehicles being used to do that, but this is an evolutionary piece. The point of it was that the tribunal determined that the works in question did count as cladding remediation, in that a cladding system was thought to be being replaced. And if I just read you the text, just a short paragraph from the decision, they said, "We are satisfied that the ordinary and clear meaning to be given to the words of paragraph 8 is that cladding remediation is to be treated as a distinct protection outside of the waterfall, not contingent on there being a relevant defect." So something done or not done during that reference period. And therefore not incorporating the requirement that the cladding in question needs to have been put on the building within the relevant period, the 30 years preceding 14 February 2022. So Valentine's 22 is what's called the specified time. That's the trigger for the backwards period. And I think this is an incorrect decision. It's being appealed, and the sort of skeleton argument of the appeal document makes clear that the ask of the FTT is as to whether this is cladding remediation and that it works independently of the relevant defect architecture, or not. And I think the implications for building owners are pretty huge as it stands. You've got defects here around windows, nothing really connected with the external surface of buildings or the spread of fire, that are being considered within the concept of cladding remediation. And you know, separately, we've been talking to clients about, as David said, a brick slit building in London that has problems with fire compartmentation risers that were built behind the skin of the wall. And that's a building that was built in the 1930s. And I'm sure all around the country, people are having these discussions. But this is a problematic decision, I think, and just put it on people's radar.
I mean, just exploring that. I mean, so all of the tower was leasehold. Was it all sold out on non-leasehold interests?
Yes, and there were stacks of them, of something like 466 leases. I think it's a huge building.
Huge building. So I suppose the concern then is it's something that you would typically expect to recover under a service charge or similar. All of this now potentially could be treated as a cost that you can't recover. So that impacts valuation and impacts your ability to sell your stock, I suppose, because I suppose we're going to see. I mean, are you starting to see retentions and things for this sort of thing, or is it always too soon for that, or is that the next thing?
Probably a bit too soon for that, but
Mm.
obviously, you know, from our perspective, we are doing a level of enhanced due diligence that we wouldn't have done 5
Yeah.
years ago, and it's, you know, it's up to clients then to make commercial decisions around that. I mean, interestingly, the number of qualifying leaseholders in this building was very small. So there was something like
Wow.
466 leases, but there were only 13 qualifying leaseholders. So the level of non-recovery wouldn't have been that significant.
Yeah.
The point of principle is that this is a 1960s building. It's about
Yeah, very old.
windows, and it's been caught as cladding remediation.
Stabilized stock. This is going to be an issue. I mean, David, are you seeing anything along this line in the work you're doing? Is that something that people are asking questions about?
Constantly. In respect of external walls, we're heavily involved in a significant number of external wall surveys and remediation programs, ranging back from buildings that were constructed 1800s all the way through to buildings that have just gone through practical completion. You know, there are issues, especially where, you know, a building may have been initially constructed in the 1800s. It may have been overclad in the 1980s or the 1990s, and we've then got an issue from then onwards.
I mean, so it's a pervading problem.
Yes.
It's a pervading problem. You can't just automatically assume because you've got an older building that it doesn't apply. And actually, even if some things are required, you've got to consider and take advice on that at an early stage, because there could be a cost implication and a cost that you can't recover under what you would typically do under what we would call a service charge or similar under a
I mean, there's certain guidance out there, for example, has 9980 that allows you to look at buildings, and even that particular document suggests that you know, buildings pre-1970 that are masonry construction are unlikely to have inappropriate cladding systems. But if work has been undertaken to that building, if any building has been overclad, we need to understand that. We need to understand it at a pretty early stage.
Understood. Thank you. Chris, back to you.
Thanks. Well, I think that was me done with case law. So
I think we've got the next one. Maybe perhaps have a bit of a chat about what's the outlook for the sector. You know, what's coming up? What do we see coming up?
So we've got just a brief slide here on what happened in 24. A sort of
please. Sorry,
retrospective. We've got a number of remediation orders that have been made. We've got a number of remediation contribution orders. So setting the principles that these new tools are being picked up and are being used. I mean, I think when the Act was first introduced, and bearing in mind that an interested person within the Act can be a public body, I felt that they weren't new and novel and complicated enough that it was probably only public bodies that would pick them up. But there have been a few privately initiated orders within the mix as well. So expect to see more of that, I suppose.
Yeah, well, if we've already got this number so far, I'm guessing it's only going to increase from here on in.
Yeah, I mean, I think that from my experience, I don't know about David's, but appetite of local authorities to use these tools is quite low. So they tend to use improvement notices as the route through to enforcement, because it's sort of tried and tested and they know how it works and they've done it before. And the costs involved with these can be quite high.
Keep developers on order as well, especially when local authorities are trying to meet housing targets, I would have thought.
Yeah. And then just to skip over a few here, just conscious of time, and if everybody's hungry like I am, let's get through the rest. But the first building liability order has been made. It's got a complicated case name, but a BLO is a new creation of the Act that allows you to pierce the corporate veil and attack parties that are linked with a developer. So perhaps if an SPV has been used, a project-specific SPV that's been dissolved or closed down and was responsible for poor building practices, it is now possible to loop around to the parent company that was at that time connected with the SPV to try to make a recovery. So,
it also impacts things like VAT structures, I would imagine. So not VAT structures, prop co-op type arrangements. So where you've got an operating company and a prop co.
Risk registers and all the rest of it. It is not the case that if development was undertaken in the 90s and that company no longer exists, that connected parties are free from potential liability. So that's just something to bear in mind, and that the point has now been proven. The government's been very good at releasing benchmarked costs. Those figures have been taken from the publicly funded support schemes, evidence of industry rates for works. That is ultimately, I think, helpful for building owners and asset owners, because it should help to stabilize the remedial cost base and allow people to hold contractors better to account. Obviously, you've got to find them, and there is a shortfall of labour and construction support in this area generally anyway. But having a published set of data is still helpful. And then second staircases, the requirement for a second staircase has been set now for 30 September 2026. Many of our clients are designing them in as a matter of course, because they feel it will add to marketability and drive sales. And there has been a scheme called Blenheim Square, I think, in London, where a developer called Hadley Clario have been criticised in the press about not designing in a second staircase and reducing the height of the building to avoid the requirement. So, there's just an example of adverse PR and optical problems created by that. And then just sort of looking forwards, a few brief points. A remediation acceleration plan was announced in December 2024. That captures both the way that developers are undertaking remedial work. We touched earlier on the developer pledge, which has had 50 some developers sign up to its terms, and 29, I think from memory, have signed up to the acceleration plan, which is a good thing. I think at the last statistics I saw that they, as a group, have completed around 25% of the buildings for which they have accepted responsibility. So clearly there's still some work to do. The government has sought to collaborate with industry and with building owners to try to move timescales forward. And there is a basic deadline set for the end of July 2029 from memory, in which the government would like to see all HRBs finished and all sub 18-metre buildings at least started and underway. And from 2019, when the private sector ACM fund was released, which was the direct response to the Grenfell tragedy, 2029 would then be a decade. It would be 10 years from the commencement of the government support exercise. The building safety levy is a new form of tax that will be levied through the building control system. We've been waiting to receive more details on that, when it's going to come in, what it will do, what the charges will be. And I've got some notes that say that the government have been trying to get that into effect for autumn 25. I think it's been pushed back now to autumn 26 to give developers and the local authority teams time to get ready. And the intention is to raise charges on significant new build developments, to raise money toward the payment of buildings that are what we call orphan buildings. They're buildings where no realistic candidate can be found to apply pressure to remediate. And there's a £3 billion cost associated with making sure that those buildings are made safe.
Excellent.
And then I think the only other things is building. Oh, well, I should just circling back a second to the point we discussed at the beginning, which is there are suggestions in the remediation acceleration plan, which is designed to apply both to developers on the one hand and privately owned buildings on the other, that if people fail to meet the time targets, that the government will legislate to create a new offence around a failure to remedy a building safety defect. What that means is that there may be a clock ticking, and we've talked about due diligence, we've talked about doing accurate surveying and risk assessments and understanding the stock that you hold and whether there are risks associated with it or not. Now is the time to do that, because if you stick your head in the sand and you allow time to tick, it may be that a new offence is created that places you into a situation you do not want to be in. And I appreciate there's, pressure in the marketplace and shortage of experts, and I think we've all read a lot about that. But if you own a building that is more than 11 meters in height, get a proper survey carried out. It's relatively expensive, I appreciate that, but I think, just again, circling back to one of the points that David made earlier around the basis on which assessments are carried out and their relative costs, we also see through the grant administration work and through separate litigation style work that perhaps where a remediation order is being defended, for example, by one of our clients, the basis of remedial work and the cost of that work varies massively. And, it would not be unusual for both parties to commission their own survey work and for the remedial costs to be £10 million apart. We've seen 1 million versus 11 million pound costings all across the piece. So
I suppose there is still there's a potential, though, if you as a seller take an initiative to actually kick that process off, then at least you're having that discussion. Otherwise you're going to be doubling up on the time delays when you're looking at selling stock on. So
that's true. And I think from my perspective, you have a baseline position that you could use to neutralize any suggestion that more extensive works are required.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which ultimately has huge value.
I mean, that's very good advice. I think that seems like a good point. I think, Chris, we've come to the end of yours.
I think that's me wrapped up.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. I know we've had a question that's come through, but we'll hold questions till the end if that's okay. And I think it seems like a good point for David. And we're going to kickstart with David's presentation. So David, you've got some slides as well, I believe.
Yes, I have. Hopefully you can see the screen, or at least they should be able to.
We will do. And I know you're going to start it off with some nice well, not nice, but more scary photos. So,
Well, yes. I mean, if I was to ask everybody on the call what type of assessments that they would be undertaking in any type of building, I would suggest that almost 100% of everybody on the call would say, "Oh, I've got to do a fire risk assessment." Fire is so familiar in our psyche. We've had a regulation and legislation for a significant period of time. Excuse me. I think there's a big difference between everyone's understanding of fire safety and structural safety. And Christopher used the term earlier about people putting their heads in the sand. And I'm not too sure if that's actually fair in respect of this, but I think there's probably a lack of understanding about structural risks. And today I want to focus purely on structural risks. I'm going to take you through a little bit of a history lesson. I'm going to show you some buildings that have failed and are failing. I'm going to look at the requirements of the legislation. I'm going to look at a technical side of it a little bit, but I really want to focus on the benefits of actually undertaking structural assessments for investors and owners before then looking at the final part of looking at how we manage risks going forward. You know, it's all very well if a lot of people are undertaking these assessments. We've got to manage those risks going forward. So hopefully I can get these working. Fantastic. I don't want to spend too much time on this. Buildings have failed. They failed through history. We can go back to the Colossus of Rhodes, Tara Salome, and the lighthouse at Alexandria. But let's start focusing very much now on residential structural failures. And what I've done here is just highlighted a number of properties, residential blocks that have failed, not due to seismic issues, earthquakes, etc., or any other natural disasters such as tsunamis, etc. These are failures due to either elements that have actions that have occurred within the building or the actual building's design. When you take a look at that, and I've only gone back to 1968, which is the Ronan Point incident. If you take those there, just them alone, we're talking of 500 dead in residential buildings due to some significant structural failings. So it's an issue that we really do need to take account of, because when you look at where these incidents have actually occurred, we're not talking about pure third world. We are talking about first world problems here. We're talking about countries that have got very good building code bases, yet we are still seeing some significant failures. So I want to first start off with Ronan Point. Ronan Point back in 1968 was effectively constructed using what's called a large panel system. A large panel system effectively is huge lumps of large panels, concrete in this case, but this particular one was designed with what's called pinned connections, and I'm not going to go into too much about that. Effectively, we had a gas explosion on the 18th floor. Now, that gas explosion blew out a load-bearing wall. That load-bearing wall was bearing the load of the floor above. That floor fell down onto the next floor. That floor couldn't take the load, and that failed. And effectively, we had what's called progressive collapse. Now, the defects were found such as poorly designed joints, for example, that weren't designed to deal with what we call lateral loads, such as a gas explosion from inside the building. In fact, when they looked at it, the joints weren't even designed to be able to effectively deal with the wind loadings that were expected. We had insufficient connections. We had things such as all of the forces focused on a very simple steel connection when actually it should have been spread across the load. And then we had poor quality control. I mean, even the concrete that they had within that was found to have included newspaper and rubbish that they've come off the site. The outcome of that particular disaster was 4 dead and 17 injured, but it led to a seismic shift in the way that the regulation was set out. And we had changes to the building regulations back in 1970. I could hear a lot of people saying, well, that's 1968. What's happened since then? Well, I'm going to take you through a video and a simulation of what's called the Champlain Towers South building that occurred back in 2021. Now, this initial section of the video is CCTV footage of the actual building collapsing. And I should point out that 98 people died within this building. So if you don't want to see that, there's no bodies or anything else like that. It's just a very simple CCTV footage followed by what's called the simulation of why it happened. And the reason why it happened is because it wasn't down to one thing. So I'm going to run the video, and what you'll see that this particular building, and this what you're seeing is CCTV footage, takes 12 seconds to collapse. Now the little insert there is the actual simulation of the collapse. And what we're going to then see is how or why that particular building collapsed in the first place. Now, this building had a pool deck, and that pool deck had parking underneath it, and we had very poor drainage. That poor drainage led to water penetrating the actual concrete. We had poor reinforcement, very, very poor construction, which led to what's called a punch-through failure of some columns. Now, that happened over a very short period of time, over one evening. That effectively put significant pressure on the actual main construction of the building. And we had what's called a catenary action, which pulled the other parts out. Effectively, though, and the major issue here is that the management team and owners were told of the drainage problems. They could see the drainage problems. They were told by a survey that actually you have reinforcement problems. But nobody did anything about it. And one of the reasons why they didn't do anything about it is because a lot of people had a report, a very technical, detailed report, but nobody understood it. Nobody knew who was accountable. And the significance of the evidence just wasn't understood. And so what we saw there was the collapse, a significant collapse in 2021. We're not talking about 30, 40 years ago. We're talking less than 5 years ago. Now, the federal government are still investigating this, and the federal government will decide how they are going to take action. But you can see a significant failure in an area which many have told me has a much more onerous and a much more robust building control and building code basis. So that's the quick history lesson. We understand, therefore, that buildings do fail. And the government have decided to set up what's called a structural safety working group. And that's a series of experts that report directly to the government. And in their last report to the government, they actually raised 4 major concerns. And I'm going to go back to Ronan Point to start off with and talk about the fact that actually aging large panel systems are still out there, particularly those that were obviously built post-war era. They were designed as a rapid response to housing shortages at the time. And what we saw at Ronan Point is, or could in fact, according to the SSWG, actually occur again. In a recent Freedom of Information request to the Building Safety Regulator, for example, it's been identified that they know of at least another 200 buildings that are HRBs that have large panel systems, that have gas within them, but they haven't had sufficient strengthening works. And so the failure to properly assess and reinforce these structures could result in catastrophic consequences, both in terms of human safety and financial liability.
Is that 200 in the UK, or is it is that just in London?
That's 200 in England.
That's 200 in England, right?
Because at the moment we are only focusing in England, where we've got no legislation in Wales, Scotland, or Northern Ireland. So that's 200 that they are aware of. But as Chris was talking about there, we could be looking at buildings that are 11 meters or above, up to 18 meters, and we still don't know. And there's a lot of buildings, for example, that have LPS, large panel systems in them as well. So we don't know if we've got a much larger problem. Why don't we know? Simple, we're not looking. And I think that is what I was hoping to get out of today, that we start to engage with our buildings, no matter what height, no matter how complex, and whether they are part of the Act or not. This really needs the whole industry to start asking questions, to be curious about their particular buildings. Last year, I would imagine most people saw in the news information related to what's called reinforced autoclaved aerated concrete, RAC, or as one of my structural engineers called it, a bar of aero. Effectively, what we've found is that it's a lightweight concrete alternative that was used from 1950s right the way through to the 1990s. Investigations are actually proving that it's just no longer suitable and sufficient. Now, RAC panels deteriorate unexpectedly. It can lead to potentially very, very quick structural failure. And the lack of inspection and oversight in the private sector really should be a considerable concern. The public sector and public buildings have undertaken a significant amount of investigation, but the Structural Safety Working Group are concerned that nobody appears to be looking in residential. And we know that RAC was used in residential structures, again, from the 1950s through to the 1990s.
So this is going to be particularly relevant for stabilized stock, people who've got tenant occupied buildings, so large scale landlords, RPs, people like that, or entities like that, who need to be looking at their existing stock, understanding where there might be challenges and where they might need to go back and improve the structure of all of these buildings.
I totally agree. That's exactly what people need to be looking at. We need to actually understand what we have. And the Structural Safety Working Group are concerned that we just don't have that understanding. They talked about two other particular growing trends and problems. Now, the growing trend of adding additional floors to existing buildings, we also refer to airspace developments. When you add floors to an existing building, again, it offers some significant commercial potential. We all know that, but the working group is extremely concerned that there just has not been significant understanding or consideration of actually, when you add another floor to a building, can the existing building actually take that particular loading? You know,
there is also an element of I know this from personal experience. There's a lack of accountability. Who do you speak to if something goes wrong? And if you're a leaseholder living in one of these buildings, or if you're a tenant living in one of these buildings, there is not enough protections in place to make sure that all of this can happen. Who do you speak to? The local authority can't take action because it frequently falls within permitted development rights. So they don't have the ability to go back and do anything unless it breaches a construction management plan. So it's very limited recourse, very limited.
Exactly. Although, if we are doing that to a building that is 6 stories and we're adding a 7th story, and therefore bringing it within the auspices of the Act, and remember that definition can change.
Yes.
And it is probably likely that it is going to change over the next couple of years, from what the regulator's talking about at the moment, that, you know, undertaking that type of work is going to come under scrutiny from the regulator, and the regulator is going to expect to see those comprehensive structural assessments of the existing building.
Just to add to that, David, the acceleration plan that was announced by Angela Rayner at the end of December did also contain suggestions that in order to to accelerate the national effort to make sure that significant buildings are made safe and are safe, that sub 18 metre buildings would also be added to the register, presumably to require building safety assessments to be called for by the regulator and to better understand that sub cohort.
And totally. And in fact, the regulator has asked the British Property Federation itself to provide some evidence on what effect the change of definition down to 11 metres could have on the industry and what issues that they saw in the future. So, it's going to happen. We're going to see the 11 metres and above. But again, it isn't just about, buildings below 11 metres do fail. We still have issues in them. I just want to continue, just go through the cladding issues as well. And we mentioned earlier the brick slip side of it. The issue of cladding failure, particularly with brick slip, is again, and other types of panel systems, is not new. But it remains a persistent problem. We are often seeing panels detaching, not whole panels, but part of panels detaching from buildings and leading to some serious accidents, and they pose a continuous threat to public safety. It comes down to lots of different reasons: poor construction technique and poor certification problems, which we can see across the whole industry. We've got a major issue in respect of construction products and their approval. Now, most people will turn around and say, okay, well, the issue relating to cladding is fire related because of what happened at Grenfell. That's heightened awareness of cladding materials. And again, almost all of the focus that many people have had is on fire safety issues, understandably. But the need for structural and stringent structural reviews of cladding materials does also remain urgent. The financial impact of rectifying unsafe cladding can, as we know, be devastating, as many property owners have already experienced firsthand. And again, one of the questions I would have later on for Christopher is that we're obviously talking the Act really focused on remediation of external walls relating to fire safety, but we also ought to be thinking about the remediation of external walls in respect to the structural safety side as well. Okay, so just finishing off what the SSWG have said, they are extremely concerned, and some of the language that they used in the report we really do need to take heed of. They believe, with the evidence that they've seen, that the construction industry has a tendency to still continue to prioritize profit over safety. And that was a terminology that they used directly to the government. They also suggested that there was a need for the industry to have a cultural shift towards actually valuing safety. Far too many organizations, they suggested, just did not want to actually understand the building because many of these issues were hidden. And if they're hidden, then they're out of sight, out of mind. And they made it very clear that too many owners, too many managers are ignoring structural concerns. Again, probably down to a lack of understanding.
I think it also depends on the way a lot of these buildings work. So if you're a build-to-rent operator, the expectation is that you're going to maintain, and there's an element of stewardship which sits with the building. So taking on a building and renting it out, you have to be vigilant because otherwise you can't rent the property out on a long-term basis. If, however, you're a building, if you own the freehold of a building which is really largely retained for the purpose of ground rents, and you wanted to say add an extra floor of apartments, the real belief behind it is actually you'll extract all of the value out of the building when you grant up all your long leaseholds. So all you're really left with is ground rents. So there isn't the element of stewardship which attaches to buildings like that, because actually once a freeholder sold off the big slices of the value, what's actually left is quite nominal. So they're not really looking after the building. All they really want to do is collect ground rents. So they're not going to be as motivated. You can have things like service charges, which allow you to charge a fee, but disproportionately, I think a lot of freeholders are looking at it from that perspective. And I suppose if you own that stock, that's something that you need to be thinking about, that actually somebody you might be selling to will all of a sudden become very alive to this. So actually, it does impact value. The problem is there isn't adequate support for that kind of situation. What happens? What happens? You know?
Totally, totally.
Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Okay, so I'm going to whiz through the next couple of slides because they're really just about where we are sitting now in respect of higher risk buildings. So we all know what a HRB is. Currently, it is a building with 2 or more dwellings, 2 or more residential premises, or student accommodation that is 18 meters or 7 stories. But we have to recognize that scope is going to change. It's a very fluid situation, and Secretary of State effectively could change both scope and extent at any time. Obviously, they'll have to go through statutory instruments, but the Grenfell Tower inquiry has made it very clear that we do need to move away from this arbitrary 18 meters or 7 stories. It's an arbitrary figure. And in fact, the minister at the time, when asked why that was a particular figure, he said, well, we had to come up with something. And so 18 meters and 7 stories was where we are, or is where we are. Okay, so what does the Act actually require us to do? Well, it basically says that we have got to assess building safety risks for the parts for which you are responsible. Now, when we consider what a building safety risk is, it's defined very clearly that it's a risk to the safety of people in or about buildings, relating specifically to the spread of fire, to structural failure, and any other prescribed matter. So we get a lot of questions asked, well, is it a legal requirement that I do a structural risk assessment? Well, from what we can see, yes, structural risk assessments are a requirement of the Building Safety Act when you look at Section 83 and Section 62. Section 62 makes it clear structural failure has to be assessed. It's a building safety risk. What the Act has then said as well is that if you have undertaken an assessment, those who are accountable for that higher risk building, and we're talking buildings now again, over 18 meters, 7 stories, they should be undertaking further assessments at regular intervals. They should be looking at those assessments when or if they suspect that the current assessment is no longer valid. For example, if we are undertaking an airspace development, then I would suggest that assessment is no longer valid. But also the regulator themselves may direct you to undertake a structural risk assessment within a specified period of time. So that's what the law says. Now, what we've also seen is some significant guidance being issued by the regulator and others. So the regulator in December last year issued their guidance on how you should apply for a building assessment certificate and the criteria that they will be reviewing. And they made it very clear. Criteria S19 makes it clear. A safety case report should include evidence to confirm that a suitable and sufficient assessment of the risk of structural failure for the building has been undertaken. And then the guidance then gives us a little bit more information and suggests, actually, do you know what? That structural risk assessment should be undertaken if the building is over 3 years old, or if the building was based using a large panel system, and buildings are still using large panel systems, or where the full design and construction details are just not available. And earlier, Bella, you mentioned the fact that some information is often difficult to get. I can assure you, it is incredibly difficult to get hold of. A lot of people just don't or have not got access to that information. But we also need, the guidance also suggests, or where there is a lack of understanding of the structural design. And finally, if there is a known history of structural problems. So again, we've got the law that tells us we need to be undertaking these. We've got guidance that tells us very clearly what the regulator is going to be expecting to review. And then just a couple of weeks ago at a Construction Industry Council webinar, the building safety regulator themselves provided some insight about what we call emerging themes. Now, they've had over 1,400 applications for building assessment certificates for existing buildings so far.
Wow, that's a lot.
They haven't produced a large number of certificates so far. They are extremely concerned about the amount of additional information they are having to ask. And basically what the regulator has said is that they clearly recognize that applicants are more familiar with fire, less familiar with structural issues. And therefore we need to be able to address that. We need to start thinking about when we're submitting our application that we've considered structure to the right degree. They are also extremely concerned about the quality of when people have actually undertaken surveys, the quality of those surveys, and there is a lack of any understanding of structural risk or even structural condition. And the regulator also pointed out that many APs, many accountable persons, assume that their fire risk assessment is all that they need to do to meet their obligations. But they've made it very clear. Structural safety, sorry?
So I was going to say, is it good practice that they should be looking at doing a structural survey before they, for instance, commence works, but then revisiting that after the work's completed to make sure that's still the case?
And then on a regular basis as well, totally. That's what we should be looking at. Structural risk assessments should now be in the same psyche that we have in respect to fire risk assessments. You may not be undertaking them every year. There may be a greater frequency, but we've got to start thinking that structural risk assessments or condition surveys are a necessity. Easy for me to say. Okay.
But that's also part of the due diligence process when you're acting on acquisitions, Chris. I think potentially it's something else that we then are looking for as lawyers, we should be asking for, and as investors, if you're looking at buying a building, that's something you've got to see not only one survey, that it's been done consistently. It's almost something that's that they've taken on board as part of their building maintenance. It's considered at a frequent intervals.
Or that you might want to consider, commissioning your own to complete the process and make sure that there's an up-to-date equivalent version. Because
you often see a lot of these building surveys being undertaken before works are done, but actually once you're on site, things are happening constantly. So actually it probably needs updating after the works are completed.
I think that's a really important point. If I turn around and tell you of on a survey that we have undertaken on the works that we've looked at, for example, just purely on external walls, we can turn around and tell you that over 50% were different to the specification that was originally provided.
That's a big number, 50%. That's huge.
It's a relatively small sample. It's just over 150 external walls, but it's still a significant.
And is there a regulatory framework to actually insist on that happening, or is that something that, again, there's no regulation which requires it, so it's just best practice?
Well, no, we do have a requirement under the Fire Safety Act, which amended the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order, but it only applies to England, to ensure that any fire risk assessment now includes an understanding and an assessment of risk relating to the exterior wall. But again, that's fire.
Yeah.
And everything is still aimed at fire. I want to quickly move on because I'm conscious that I've got a limited amount of time, and I was a bit worried about putting this slide in, but I'm putting it in anyway because I think it's a really important part. Dame Judith Hackett, who obviously is very well known in the industry, she was speaking at the Sir James Waite lecture for the CIOB back gone on the industry, suggesting that there is a lack of behavioural change, suggesting, and this is her words, that there's an appalling attitude that continues to prevail. Even though the Building Safety Act has been in place for 3 years, we are still seeing significant problems. In her speech, she actually suggested that we should be starting to name and shame those who continue to try and game the system. and she was extremely critical of the applications that were being submitted to the regulator. She suggested that that was a significant cause of some of the delays. And she highlighted one particular case, and it's quite a shocking case, where someone was submitting their justification to the regulator and wrote a one-page document with these words on it: "I don't know why I have to do this. It complies." So even with the warnings, even with the guidance, even with the clear requirements that are set out within the Act and the regulations, we're still seeing issues with both development and existing stock. And my question to the industry, and I'll brush straight over it, is why are we not getting this? Why are we not getting this, especially when the benefits can be great? And therefore, I want to focus on perhaps the 6 main benefits that we can get from structural risk assessments. So, yeah, structural risk assessments, as we can see, are a legal requirement. We've made that very clear. But investors and owners also could stand to gain significantly, from undertaking their own structural investigations of any building, no matter how tall, how small, no matter what they are used for. Structural assessments and investigations can serve as a really good, vital tool to ensure the safety, longevity, and the value of your investment. They support risk mitigation and safety compliance by identifying hidden defects within them before they become critical. By being proactive, effectively, you are able to address issues early, often preventing what could be a minor concern from developing into a major structural defect. It can also reduce your liability risks with structural failures, and clearly ensures that you are complying with, as what Chris was saying earlier, an evolving set of building safety regulations, thus hopefully avoiding any potential legal consequences. It can also support asset protection and value by preserving or extending the lifespan of the building, addressing any structural weakness basis, and therefore enhancing building resale and rental value. A good, well-maintained structure not only retains its market value, but it's also going to appreciate over time. It can also support prevention of costly emergency repairs by identifying potential risks or issues early. And in addition to that, it can also reduce long-term repair and insurance costs by mitigating risks in advance. Structural risk assessments can play a really vital role in long-term property management and maintenance planning, making sure that we focus what's important and effective rather than what is not necessarily as important. So it can prevent sudden financial losses due to unexpected structural failures. And with that in mind, I just really want to consider what happened at Barton House. Barton House is a 65-year-old 15-story tower block based in Bristol. It was built in the late 1950s using reinforced concrete walls, basically a large panel system. And in November 2023, an engineer's report, which was undertaken as part of the owner's safety case process, so they were going through the right process, it concluded that there was significant risk due to disproportionate collapse. There was a lack of structural ties between the floors. And in addition, the quality of the concrete was inadequate. And basically, they had to undertake works within the building. But going back through the history of it, there were strengthening works and concrete repairs that were carried out on the block around about 1970. But there were no records of any structural survey between 1970 and 2023. Although there were some notes saying that, yeah, we undertake these all the time. So the costs associated with that, we had 250 residents that had to be rehoused in local hotels to the cost of the owners between November 23 to February 24. The cost of the works within the building were estimated to be in the millions. And we've got residents themselves, many of which have said, we just don't want to be here anymore, but we can't sell. And also they don't trust the owner and they don't trust the building itself.
Yeah.
So the costs can be significant. Who would want to now live in Barton House? Knowing that it's been in the press, knowing that we've got structural or had structural issues within that particular building. So
I mean, that's a health warning for anybody who's basically buying a building which has gone through these issues. And anybody who's looking at sort of retrofitting a building with a view to sort of enhancing the development, it's a concern that they're going to have going forward.
Exactly. I just want to go through the last few other benefits of structural risk assessments. Obviously, they can support and enhance marketability. Under the Act, those who hold accountability are bound to share information between each other and within the residents themselves. So if residents can see that you're taking your responsibilities seriously and undertaking those regular assessments and surveys, that's also or could possibly attract higher quality tenants and buyers who may prioritize safety and reliability. When my son purchased his property, the first thing I was asking for of the owner was not only the FRAEW, the fire risk assessment, the structural risk assessment, and we decided that that particular building would not be particularly good for him because I couldn't get anything out of the owner. And so we moved on to something else. So it can contribute to higher occupancy rates and you can improve tenants' confidence within the building. And remember, they are going to see this information, or if there's a lack of it, they're going to see that as well. I think it's also important that we recognize that actually it facilitates future development. In the ever-evolving real estate market, opportunities for expansion and innovation are going to be constantly with us. So we need to understand the integrity of our buildings, not just the fire basic elements. We need to understand the structural integrity of those buildings. We need to look at assessing structural integrity, especially if we're upgrading it, especially for airspace developments. And we also need to make sure that we consider modifications or extensions. And when I'm talking about modifications, I'm not talking about significant things. A structural risk assessment that we did about 6 months ago for a particular client found that in a beam, a concrete beam in a basement within a higher risk building, an engineer who was asked to lay some new cabling had drilled a 3-inch core hole through a load-bearing beam, drilling through at the wrong place, the place which you would not want it to be, drilling through reinforcement. So it isn't just about, major developments. Simple maintenance elements need to be considered. And the biggest problem is that managers just don't understand that that would or could have a major impact.
Yeah.
And then finally, I just want to talk about the fact that the other benefit is that you're going to be aligning yourself, if you undertake these types of surveys, to safety guidelines, thus reducing the risk of fines and enforcement action. And obviously, you're going to be able to prove that you're demonstrating compliance through any due diligence process, especially if you're going through financing, refinancing, and absolutely. Even insurance negotiations. I mean, I would imagine insurers will want to understand this process. I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to quickly run through the next ones because I'm going to start to get a little bit techie. And I hopefully haven't been so techie that I normally would.
No, it's been really informative. Yeah, absolutely.
The health and safety executive, and therefore the regulator, has said that, look, these assessments have got to be proportional to the risk. And the regulator has defined that proportionality element based around the idea that measures should be taken to control a risk should be in proportion to the risk itself. So it's based on the idea that resources should be focused on the greatest risks, not on low risk areas. Effectively, it's a balancing act. And so they actually have set out their own views on how you can determine proportionality. It's severity, likelihood, scale and nature of the building and the hazards, the density and the types of people that you have within the building, and then of course the number of buildings. The number of people within that particular building. I think the best way of looking at proportionality, though, is to look at 5 key areas. If we look at different types of buildings that have been built over the centuries, age plays a really important part. Older buildings were subject to codes which had what we call lower factors of safety. So those older buildings had lower factors of safety, and the design of those buildings also was subject to different building codes at the time, and they don't necessarily adapt quickly enough or sufficiently enough to the evolving modern methods of construction as they are at the time. We also got to look at the construction techniques as well. Different construction techniques have very clearly known defects and issues. We know the issues relating to large panel systems. We know the issues relating to steel structures, to concrete structures, which brings me on to then material usage. We all know, if you read the Grenfell Tower Inquiry report, that material testing is not where it needs to be. In fact, the words in the report is that it's questionable. And so we need to now start thinking about the materials that we're using. We know what type of defects we are likely to get with various types of material, and therefore we need to consider those in respect of our proportionality review. And then lastly, we need to think about occupancy, especially in respect of conversions, of converting from a commercial property to a residential property. Now, most people wouldn't realize the fact that if you change from a commercial property to a residential property, you are changing the loading.
Yeah.
But you're actually changing it on a better basis. You have a lower set of loading requirements within a residential block than you would within a commercial office. But we need to consider that whole process. And the way that the Institute of Structural Engineers have actually provided their own guidance on this, and in fact, it's all based around a very simple 4-stage approach. We should be collating building information. We should be identifying those potential weaknesses based on those 5 particular areas. We should then be assessing those building weaknesses by actually looking at the building. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be undertaking full intrusive investigations, but it may be that we have to look at targeted investigations at very clear issues or areas that we are concerned about. And we also have to consider how the building has been modified. And then lastly, it's all about recording that, but that comes down again to both guidance issued by the Institute of Structural Engineers. There's a fantastic website called Cross UK, which tells the whole world about the types of issues that we've got and defects we've got within our housing stock, and other types of building as well. And obviously, we've got guidance that's been issued by the BSR. But effectively, it isn't a once-only process. It's a process that needs to be considered over time. The last thing I just really wanted to quickly go through is perhaps the difference between assessments and condition surveys. Condition surveys are or should be part of your planned preventative maintenance program, but they are guidance. Whereas a structural risk assessment, which does a different job, is a legal requirement. And I suppose the easiest way we can put that is that a structural risk assessment is a forward-looking process. It's a process aimed at identifying and considering potential hazards and risks within your building. It basically evaluates the likelihood and also the consequences of any structural failure. And that will help you then guide your decision-making process for risk mitigation. A condition survey is actually something completely different. It's a diagnostic survey. It's looking at the current physical state of the structure, and it's focusing on, and it's far more detailed, and focusing on the detecting defects, detecting known deterioration, because if they're undertaken every 3 years, as the Code of Practice recommends, then you're going to have that baseline and an understanding of where that deterioration is occurring, and therefore adjust your maintenance programs accordingly. So the last couple of slides then, I just really want to talk about the duties on the principal and accountable persons, specifically to manage risk. And I've shown the whole of section 84 there, but it's the D section. Sorry, it should be E, actually, my apologies. It's the fact that the accountable person has got to make and give effect for the purpose of ensuring effective planning, organization, control, monitoring, and review of the steps that you're taking. And that effectively, when you look at the guidance issued by the regulator, is based around delivering a building safety management system. And your building safety management system, based upon the guidance, should include this. So it's very clear that we cannot just assess buildings. We can't just assess buildings and take that assessment and put it on the shelf and let it gather dust. We've got to manage those structural issues that are raised. And that management approach, especially in high-risk buildings, is something that the regulator is going to pay very particular attention to. So finally then, what would I suggest? I think we need to recognize that buildings fail. And I wouldn't suggest it's down to one thing only. It's not just about structural risks from design and construction. It's also about how we manage the building, the actions we take, or even the inactions that we take. I think we've also got to recognize that the working group has highlighted that there's a need for a cultural shift towards valuing safety and a comprehensive understanding of the scale of hidden defects. Bella asked me right at the very beginning of this whole process when we met about what should we be doing. And I said, very simple, we need to look. We need to look now before it is too late. There is a plethora of benefits for investors and owners in undertaking structural risk assessments. We just need to understand the fact that we've got to start that process off. We need to understand the results of structural risk assessments, and therefore you should be asking questions of your experts and actually be curious about your buildings. They can enhance the value of your building. The last couple of things then, structural risk assessments quite clearly are a legal requirement, but they have benefits for other types of buildings outside the scope of the Act. And in our experience, what we're seeing is that the BSR is asking questions. They are seeking clarifications. In almost every organisation that hasn't had a structural risk assessment, we are seeing a request from the regulator within 7 days, by the way, to provide that risk assessment. And if you haven't got it, you're not going to be able to deliver that within 7 days. And lastly, then, you've got a legal duty to manage the outcomes.
Thank you, David. I mean, that's fantastic. I'm mindful of time. We've got a couple of quick questions, so we'll run through those now. So the first one, what risks do you see with new build schemes going through the gateway process, operating under the transition arrangement? Clients have done this, but perhaps not thought about the future risks of doing so, with the focus being to have avoided the program delays associated with hard stop gateway sign-offs. Who wants to take that one? Chris?
I'm happy to.
Yeah, David.
We're seeing, I think we have seen a large number of people rush to get started on their building, so they weren't involved with the gateway process. And I think it was fair that the industry saw that they were going to be delays within that. I think the fact that they are still going to have to go through after construction this process, and they're going to be caught up within the regime, means that it would be folly if they didn't look at making sure that they have exactly the right information when they're actually taking ownership of the building. If someone's going through Gateway 3, I certainly would not be signing anything unless I had both legal advice and technical advice to turn around and say that the documentation that I have been provided with is suitable and sufficient. That would certainly be a strong piece of advice that we would recommend.
Thank you. Anything you want to add there, Chris?
No, I think David's covered it there. Yeah, I
Fantastic.
agree with all of that.
And I suppose the second question relates to common hold. Will apply to existing leasehold buildings with the priorities for the common hold owners. It's likely to be managing, reducing service charge. Is this a concern for how historical and existing issues will be addressed? I mean, I suppose we won't know till what the legislation says at this stage. It's a bit early to assess, but I don't know if you've got a view on that, Chris or David.
I think there are good reasons to be concerned there, and parts of the way the Act is prepared that may not bite effectively.
Yeah, I think we won't know. Yeah, absolutely.
You got to wait for the legislation.
We've got one more question from John Fulham. Thank you. Read the building safety levy. Here are the draft rates. Oh, so he's very kindly, thank you, John, sent us the actual building safety levy rates in the Q&A if anybody needs them. I am mindful we've had a marathon session, and I imagine there'll be questions which will probably flow after that. So by all means, please reach out to the BPF and we can run through them. But there's a few takeaways, I think, from all of this. And I'd like sort of final thoughts from Chris. What are your final thoughts? What's the one piece of advice you would give to anybody who's looking at investing in the sector and you'd like to see from the government?
Yeah, I mean, I think I was going to start with a piece of trivia and then a takeaway. Well, let's do the takeaway first. I think it's the points we've both expressed, isn't it? Safety and maintaining safety is going to be critical in the context of maintaining value, occupancy rates, good relations with your insurers. I agree with all of that. And it may be that there are criminal sanctions and penalties to come that can be avoided through ensuring good performance.
Yeah.
And then trivia, David mentioned earlier the reason for the 18-meter rule. When we first started our work, I was under the impression that the 18-meter rule was rooted somehow in the building regulations. I don't think it was. I think that was a myth. We have always worked on the there we go, David's nodding. We have always worked on the basis that the reason for 18 meters and HRB starting at that level is because that is the height at which you can get fire trucks to the outside of a building, a ladder fully extended, and spray from the hose to be able to tackle a fire. At heights above that level, so 18 meters and above, you've got to tackle the blaze from inside a building, which is obviously a lot more difficult and dangerous for the firefighters and for the residents. So that's why, therefore, an enhanced regulatory regime was created at that height level.
Perfect. And then, again, David, from your perspective?
A little bit of myth there as well. So I'm going to be a little bit of a myth buster. There are very, very clear. You have high reach. You're quite right. If you take a basic fire tender, fire appliance, you can tackle fires like that. But you have high reach appliances now, which can go well beyond the 18 meter. And they've been in force for many, many years. I suppose the biggest takeaway I would want to put over it, and it comes down to the word that's on the screen at the moment: question. I think we need understanding of our buildings, and we cannot just rely upon what we believe is satisfactory. And it's not a good idea to use Chris's words here, to bury our head in the sand. We need to be curious about our buildings. We need to ask questions about our buildings. And I would ask people not to be afraid that you'll be opening up a can of worms. That can of worms later on could in fact be the difference between life and death for many of the people who are in that building.
I mean, there's so much valuable information there. I think for the sector, for the housing sector, I think there's a number of challenges. One of them has to be arguably that we just haven't got the resource to do it. There's so much required to satisfy the requirements now to comply with legislation. There's still so much uncertainty around everything. It seems to be that actually a lot of this means you've got to take action early. You've got to think about these things early. You've got to have the discussions early. If you're looking at investing in the sector and pulling on a new project, then you've got to consider how you've got to comply, and that means engaging with the professionals at an early stage so that you can streamline and be anticipating a lot of the questions that are going to be asked. If you're looking at buying a building which is older, you can't automatically assume that you will not be subject to some of the things that we've discussed about today, because it looks like it's still a work in progress as to what that might look like. If you're a build to rent operator, it's not only a factor about sort of how you're going to exit your strategy, it's also going to be a question of how you're going to look after your residents and whether they're going to want to actually stay in the building, particularly if you're looking at retrofitting a building. I mean, it sounds like there's so much to think about, but the key to all of it is absolutely asking questions, but also engaging at an early stage and allowing for the fact that actually some of these things we don't really know the answer to fully yet, and it's still a work in progress. I know the BPF have called for a number of additional regimes, including asking for more resource and things like that. So I think we're going to see continued support from the sector to try to improve some of these things. But thank you both of you very much for your time, and thank you everybody for bearing with us on a marathon 2-hour session. We've got to the end of it. Hopefully you've got time to grab a sandwich. Please do reach out if you've got any questions to the professionals. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Chris. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.